I never imagined I would walk into a police station because of my own relationship. Not because of a crime in the usual sense, but because something in my life had quietly gone missing, and I didn't know how else to explain it. By the time I reached the glass doors, I was already exhausted, emotionally drained in a way sleep could never. My name is Ethan, and for almost 4 years, Mark had been the center of my world. We met in a crowded cafe, bonded over bad coffee and shared dreams, and promised each other the kind of love that felt permanent. Back then, everything about him felt warm, his laughter, his attention, even his silence. I used to believe that when two people loved each other enough, distance had no space to grow between them. That I was wrong. Somewhere along the way, Mark became someone I lived with instead of someone I lived for. Our conversations turned mechanical, reduced to logistics and reminders. He spoke more to his phone than to me. Even when we sat on the same couch, it felt like there was an invisible wall between us, thin, but impossible to cross. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough anymore. Maybe I had changed. I tried to fix things in small ways, cooking his favorite meals, asking about his day, suggesting weekends away. Mark always had an excuse: deadlines, meetings, stress. He wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. He was polite, distant, and emotionally unavailable in a way that made me feel unreasonable for wanting more. What hurt most wasn't the lack of affection. It was the absence of presence. When I spoke, he listened just long enough to reply, not long enough to understand. I started to feel like a background character in my own relationship. The night everything shifted, we had an argument so quiet it barely qualified as one. I told him I felt lonely. He told me I was overthinking. I asked him when the last time was that he truly looked at me. He didn't answer. Instead, he sighed, the kind of sigh that carries exhaustion, not regret. That was the moment I realized something fundamental had broken. Later that evening, I went out alone. I told myself I needed air, but what I really needed was space from the silence we shared. Somewhere between the subway ride and the crowded streets, I noticed my phone was gone. I searched my pockets, retraced my steps, felt panic rise in my chest. My phone wasn't just a device, it held everything. Messages, photos, fragments of a life I was already afraid of losing that I didn't tell Mark. I didn't want another conversation that ended in indifference, so I went to the nearest police station instead. The building was older than I expected, dimly lit, with the kind of institutional smell that made everything feel serious and final. As I stood in line, I realized how symbolic the situation felt. I had come to report something missing, but I wasn't even sure what I was really looking for anymore: my phone, my sense of control, or the version of myself that still believed in us. When it was my turn, the officer at the front desk asked for basic details. His tone was neutral, efficient, professional. He typed into a computer while I spoke, barely looking up. It felt strangely familiar, another person half listening to me, another conversation reduced to procedure. Then he paused and said, "Someone will take you to a private room to get the full statement." I nodded, grateful for the chance to sit down. A few moments later, another officer approached from behind the desk. He introduced himself as Daniel Reed. His voice was calm, softer than I expected, and when he looked at me, he actually held my gaze. Not in a way that felt intrusive, just attentive, present. "Follow me," he said. That we walked down a narrow hallway, past closed doors and muted conversations. The sounds of the station faded with every step. Daniel opened one of the doors and gestured for me to enter. The room was small but quiet, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a single window that overlooked nothing but brick. As the door closed behind us, I felt something shift inside me, something subtle, almost imperceptible. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was relief. For the first time in weeks, I was in a room where someone was about to listen to me. I didn't know it then, but that door wasn't just separating me from the noise of the station. It was separating me from the life I had been trying to hold together. And whatever I was about to say next would change far more than just the contents of a report. Daniel closed the door gently, as if he understood that whatever I was carrying inside didn't need any more noise. The room felt insulated from the rest of the station, sealed off from ringing phones and distant voices. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and I sat, suddenly aware of how tense my shoulders were. "Take your time," he said, pulling a notepad closer. "Start from the beginning." I told him about the phone, where I thought I lost it, the subway line, the crowded platform. The words came out automatically, like I was reciting a script. Daniel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his pen moving slowly across the paper. But unlike the officer at the front desk, he wasn't just recording information. He was actually paying attention. When I hesitated, searching for a detail I couldn't remember, he didn't rush me. He waited. That alone felt unfamiliar. After a few minutes, he looked up and asked, "Rough day?" The question was simple, almost casual, but something in his tone made it land differently. It wasn't procedural. It was human. "Yeah," I said, before I could stop myself. "You could say that." He studied me for a second, then leaned back slightly in his chair. "You don't have to answer this, but, was today already bad before you lost the phone?" I let out a quiet laugh, the kind that carries more frustration than humor. "Is it that obvious?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes people don't come in because of what they lost. They come in because they're already overwhelmed." I didn't plan to tell him anything personal. That wasn't why I was there. But the room felt too quiet, and he felt too present, and the truth slipped out before I could filter it. "My boyfriend and I, we're not doing great." Daniel didn't react the way most people did. No awkward sympathy, no immediate advice. He just nodded, slowly, as if that explained something. "I'm sorry," he said. "That kind of stress makes everything else feel heavier." I stared at the edge of the desk. "It's not even a big fight. That's the problem. It's just distance. Like we're slowly fading out, and I'm the only one who notices." Daniel's pen stopped moving. He looked at me, really looked at me this time. "That can be worse than fighting," he said. "At least arguments mean both people are still engaged." The word stayed with me. Engaged. That was exactly what I had been missing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, like space being made for something honest. "I feel stupid saying all this to a stranger," I admitted. "You're not a stranger," Daniel replied without thinking. Then he paused, as if realizing what he had said. "I mean, you are, but sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who isn't part of your life." I nodded. That was true. Mark knew every version of me, yet I felt invisible around him. Daniel knew nothing about me, yet I felt seen. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel asked a few more questions about the phone, but the conversation had already shifted. It no longer felt like a report. It felt like a confession disguised as paperwork. Every time I spoke, he listened with a kind of patience I hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't check the clock. He didn't look at his screen. He stayed with the moment. At one point, I realized I had stopped thinking about Mark altogether. That realization made my chest tighten. That I leaned back in my chair, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. The desk between us felt smaller than it had before. Daniel noticed my shift and asked softly, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." He nodded again. "You look like someone who's been carrying things alone for too long." The sentence hit harder than I expected. My throat tightened, and I had to look away. I didn't know it showed. "Sometimes it does," he said. "Not in obvious ways. More in how people talk. Or how they pause before answering." I looked back at him. Our eyes met, and this time neither of us looked away. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, filled with something I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't desire. It was recognition. That I felt it in the way my breathing slowed. In the way the room seemed to shrink around us. Daniel cleared his throat and glanced down at the notepad. "I'll file this report. If the phone turns up, you'll be contacted." "Thank you," I said, and meant more than just the words. That he stood, and I stood too, reluctant in a way that surprised me. He opened the door, but neither of us moved through it right away. "Ethan," he said, reading my name from the form. "For what it's worth, you don't sound like someone who's asking for too much. You sound like someone who's asking the wrong person." I didn't know how to respond to that. I just nodded and walked past him into the hallway, but even as I left the room, I felt it, an unfamiliar pull, quiet but undeniable. I had come to report something missing, yet somehow I was walking out with something new, and I wasn't sure whether that should have comforted me, or scared me. I told myself I wouldn't think about Daniel again once I left the station. That whatever I had felt in that room was just a reaction to stress, to loneliness, to being listened to for the first time in months. I convinced myself it was nothing, but nothing followed me home. Mark was already asleep when I entered our apartment, his phone charging on the nightstand, his back turned toward my side of the bed. I stood there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, waiting for something: guilt, affection, recognition. I felt none of it. Instead, I felt the echo of Daniel's voice in my head: "You sound like someone who's asking the wrong person." That I lay beside Mark, but sleep didn't come. My mind replayed small details from the station: the way Daniel waited before speaking, the calm in his eyes, the way he said my name as if it mattered. I hated myself for comparing them. I hated myself even more for realizing how easy the comparison was. The next day, I checked my email and saw a message from the police department. My phone had been found. That I should have felt relieved. Instead, my first thought was Daniel. That I returned to the station that evening to collect it. The building felt different this time, not intimidating, not cold. Familiar. Almost inviting. When I approached the front desk, the officer told me Daniel would bring it out. A few minutes later, he appeared from the same hallway as before. "Hey," he said, smiling in that restrained, careful way of his. "Hey," I replied, suddenly nervous for reasons I couldn't explain. That he handed me the phone, our fingers brushing for just a second. It was accidental, but neither of us moved away immediately. The moment lingered, quiet and charged. "You found it," I said. "Yeah. Lucky timing." There was a pause. Too long for a professional exchange. Too short to ignore. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" Daniel asked. "I'm on break." I hesitated. I should have said no. I knew that. But something in me was already walking toward the hallway before my mind caught up. That we ended up in the same room. This time, the door didn't close because it had to. It closed because neither of us suggested leaving it open. That we sat across from each other again, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no form, no report, no reason to pretend this was about procedure. It felt like two people meeting in the middle of something neither had named yet. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Daniel admitted. "I wasn't sure I should," I replied. That he smiled faintly. And yet, I echoed. Silence settled between us, heavier than before. Not awkward, anticipatory. I noticed how his posture mirrored mine, how his attention never drifted. I felt seen in a way that was no longer just emotional. It was personal now. Intimate. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I told him. "About asking the wrong person." Daniel's expression shifted, subtle but real. And I realized I don't know when my relationship turned into something I keep explaining instead of something I live. He nodded slowly. "That's a painful realization." "I don't want to be the kind of person who cheats," I said quietly. "But I also don't want to be the kind of person who disappears inside their own life." The words hung between us like a confession and a warning at the same time. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Sometimes people cross lines without realizing they've been standing near them for a long time. Our eyes met again. This time, neither of us pretended it was innocent. "I think we're standing near one right now," I said. "Yes," he replied. "We are." Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt louder than any sound in the building. I could feel my heart in my throat, my pulse in my hands. The room seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us and the space we were about to step into. Daniel reached out first, not to grab, not to pull, just to place his hand over mine. The touch was gentle, careful, and devastating. That I didn't pull away. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what we did, but because of what we both allowed ourselves to feel. The line wasn't crossed with urgency or passion. It was crossed with understanding. With relief. With the quiet agreement that something real was happening, even if it shouldn't. That I thought of Mark then. Of our apartment. Of the years we had built. The memories felt distant, like photographs from a life I no longer inhabited. I should go, I whispered. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, his hand still resting over mine. I know. But neither of us moved. When I finally stood, my body felt heavier than when I had arrived. I walked past him, opened the door, and stepped back into the hallway. The station noise rushed in around me, loud and disorienting. That I didn't look back. On the way home, Mark texted me, "Did you get your phone?" I stared at the screen for a long time before replying, "Yeah. I got it." That I didn't tell him about the room. Or the silence. Or the hand that had felt more real than anything I had touched in years, but I knew something irreversible had already happened. That I had walked into the station to recover what I lost, and walked out having lost something else entirely. I didn't tell Mark about Daniel. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even when he asked why I seemed distracted over breakfast. I said I was tired. He accepted the answer too easily, which somehow made it worse. For days, I tried to return to normal. I answered Mark's questions, laughed at the right moments, went through the familiar motions of a relationship that looked intact from the outside. But inside, everything felt altered, as if a single thread had been pulled loose and the rest of my life was slowly unraveling. Daniel stayed in my thoughts more than I wanted to admit. Not in a dramatic way, not as a fantasy, but as a presence. A memory that felt unfinished. I kept replaying the moment his hand rested over mine, not because of the touch itself, but because of what it represented. Choice. Attention. The possibility of being wanted without having to ask, that terrified me. That I checked my phone constantly, half expecting a message from him even though he had no reason to contact me. We hadn't exchanged numbers. We hadn't made plans. What we shared existed only in that room, behind that door, in a space that felt both real and impossible to return to. Mark noticed the shift before I did. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner. Did I do something? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was rare. For once, he was looking at me, not through me, not around me, but at me. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I feel like we've been distant for a long time." He frowned. "We're fine, Ethan. We just have busy lives. That's normal." The words felt rehearsed, like something he had told himself often enough to believe. I wanted to argue, to explain how loneliness could exist even in shared spaces, how absence could be emotional before it was physical. But I didn't. I nodded instead, and in that moment, I realized something painful. Daniel had asked how I felt without needing to be prompted. Mark only asked when he sensed me slipping away. A week passed. Then another. I tried to bury what happened, to treat it as a fleeting encounter born from stress and timing. But the more I ignored it, the more it defined me. I became hyper-aware of everything Mark didn't notice, the way he interrupted me, the way he rarely asked questions, the way our intimacy had turned into habit instead of desire. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, his phone lit up on the bed. A notification. Just a name and a message preview. "Can't wait to see you again." My chest tightened. I stared at the screen, frozen between instinct and fear. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The implication was enough. The irony was almost unbearable. I had been drowning in guilt over a single emotional connection, while Mark was apparently living a life I knew nothing about. When he returned, I didn't confront him. Not immediately. I just watched him, how relaxed he seemed, how unaware of the shift inside me. And for the first time, I wondered if my silence wasn't loyalty at all, but avoidance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the message. About Daniel. About myself. About how easily people justify their choices when they feel unseen. I had been afraid of becoming someone who betrayed. I hadn't considered the possibility that I was already with someone who had. The next day, I found myself walking past the police station again that I didn't plan it. My feet just carried me there, as if they recognized a place where something honest had once existed. I stood across the street for a long time, watching people enter and leave, feeling ridiculous for expecting anything more than coincidence that I didn't see Daniel. Instead, I saw my reflection in the glass, tired, uncertain, standing between two lives and belonging fully to neither. One built on history, the other on possibility. One familiar, the other terrifyingly real. For the first time, I stopped asking myself who I should choose, that I asked myself who I was becoming, and I realized the real conflict wasn't between Mark and Daniel. It was between the version of me who stayed silent to keep the peace, and the version of me who was finally starting to admit the truth, even if it meant losing everything I thought I had. That I turned away from the station and walked home, knowing that whatever came next would require a conversation I could no longer postpone, not with Daniel, not even with Mark, but with myself.